Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I want to talk about the state of things towards the end of World War II, going into 1945. At this point, past Germany's last gasp effort in the Battle of the Bulge, the loss of the Axis powers was basically set in stone. Whether or not they could win the war wasn't the question anymore, but rather the question was when and how the war would end. Italy fell a couple years prior, Germany would fall in May 1945 after being sandwiched by American, British, and Soviet forces, and this left Japan as the last man standing. And they were barely standing at that, being kept alive basically by stubbornness and national pride. This would put the entirety of the United States and allied militaries in a bit of a weird spot. Barring some kind of miracle, Japan was losing the war. Unless there was a Divine Wind Part 2, the Divining, that swept away the allied powers magically, Japan was screwed. This reality meant that their combined focus could afford to be a bit more split, planning for the conclusion of the war and planning for life after the war. Attention could be somewhat taken from the more proven technology and instead put towards newer, more experimental tech, and the new hotness that was about to push military aviation to even greater heights was jet power. So while one part of the military was formulating how to end the war, whether it was through a direct land invasion or nuclear explosions, the other part was looking at bringing their forces into the jet age. More standard piston engine propeller aircraft had hit a bit of a wall towards the end of the war, and the effective speed limit for a fighter that was powered by a propeller seemed to be somewhere in the 400 to 500 mile an hour range, with speeds at the higher end of that often being achieved with the aid of a dive. The clear path forward was jet-powered. It just offered so much more potential. But with them being early in their development and use, their great speed potential was offset by a multitude of issues, from poor acceleration to excessive fuel consumption to a general lack of reliability. Now, for your land-based forces like the Army, that poor acceleration factor on jet engines wasn't a massive issue really, with there inherently being more open space to use on the ground than on the water. But for your naval forces, jet power presented a serious problem. That poor acceleration and lack of reliability meant that taking off from shorter aircraft carrier runways was incredibly difficult and dangerous, almost impossible. On the larger carriers, it would at least be a little bit more practical, since the runway was larger, but on smaller escort carriers and just older carriers, there was basically no chance that they could be using early jet planes. Something else was going to be needed for the early jet age for the Navy. How exactly could the Navy benefit from the higher speed potential of jet engines, while also benefiting from the lower speed acceleration and control that was offered by your propeller engines? Well, they could combine them. And our subject for today is one of those attempts to combine jets and propellers to make a viable carrier-based attacker. This is Douglas's attempt at a turboprop attack plane. This is the Douglas A2D Skyshark. Its story begins in mid-1945, June 4th to be precise, with the Chief of Naval Operations ordering the Bureau of Aeronautics to begin a new search for a jet-powered attack plane. They had been spurred on both by late war appearances of jet-powered aircraft and the very correct belief that piston engines were near or at their peak. However, as they were also concerned about the detriments of early jet engines, they requested that whatever this new design was, it would use a turboprop rather than a turbojet. The turboprop is essentially a happy medium between a jet and a normal piston engine. Instead of the gas turbine generating thrust out of the exhaust or propelling nozzle, that thrust is instead generated by transferring the power generated from the turbine over to a propeller, and that greater power allows the plane to fly a good bit faster than a normal piston engine, while also retaining the better low-speed control. Of course, turboprops aren't without their detriments, and there's a reason why you don't see them that often on modern military aircraft. Because they still use a propeller, they inherently have higher drag that restricts them. Turboprop engines aren't used for supersonic speeds, at least not typically, as a lot of finagling would have to be done to the propellers to allow them to reach such speeds. Turboprops basically just kinda raise the ceiling from normal piston engines a little bit. Still, at least in the interim, until jets or aircraft carriers were improved to the point that carrier-based jets were more viable and more safe, the turboprop would be a fine temporary solution. For the task of utilizing this newer technology, the Bureau of Aeronautics would task Douglas Aircraft with the job on June 25, 1945. Now, why exactly Douglas was tasked with the job, I am not sure, and I am unsure if any other companies were given serious consideration. But I would assume that Douglas was given the job both because of their experience with attack aircraft, like the Dauntless dive bomber and A-26, and because just a couple months prior, Douglas had first flown the XBT-2D, a high-performance attack plane later known as the A-1 Skyraider. As turboprop engines were still a pretty new thing, though, Douglas first had to do some initial design studies to figure out what the most optimal power plant and configuration was, and for this, they proposed 3 different initial models. The Model D557A was to use 2 General Electric TG100s in separate wing-mounted nacelles. This was likely to be a twin-prop plane. The Model D557B was to have those same engines, but both mounted in the nose, connected to the same single propeller. Lastly, the Model D557C was to just use a single Westinghouse 25D. Douglas would also propose that there should be a design that would use the also in development Allison T40, which basically used 2 smaller turboprops combined to run as a singular unit. But for some reason this proposition was rejected, and Douglas had to proceed forward with these first 3 designs. These 3 initial designs proceeded to and even passed the mock-up stage, to the point where one of the Skyraider prototypes was to be modified to fit one of these turboprop engine setups. However, Douglas never actually got to do this, as both of the intended engines of these 3 models ended up failing, leaving Douglas without a powerhouse to fit on the Skyraider frame. This would temporarily leave the project dormant for over a year, until in early 1947, where the Allison T40 and some other turboprop engines had developed to the point that it warranted once again trying to make a new Navy attack plane. This time, though, it was an open design contest for an attack plane that was capable of both air-to-air and air-to-ground combat. Douglas, though, had a very clear lead in the contest due to these earlier design studies that they conducted. Using the Skyraider design as a sort of baseline, Douglas proposed a heavily modified but similar aircraft. And considering the fact that I don't know any of the other planes that were submitted in this open contest, Douglas seems to have won very easily. Douglas would receive a letter of intent for their design on June 11, 1947. By early September, a mock-up had been examined, and by September 25th, Douglas received a contract to make 2 prototype XA2D1s, measuring in at 12.55 meters long, 15.24 meters wide, and 5.21 meters tall. The A2D design certainly bore a very strong resemblance to the Skyraider. In fact, an initial selling point was that the A2D would use a lot of the Skyraider's parts, so cost and production time would be reduced. Looking at the two designs side by side, though, you'll notice that the A2D design was a bit more thick, with a much pointier nose. Because the Allison T40 engine was larger and was also different than the Wright R3350 radial engine that the Skyraider used, a lot had to be changed, both internally and externally, thus making the A2D look both the same and different at the same time, almost kind of uncanny in some way. Largely remaining the same would be its wings, with the same wingspan and wing area, but the A2D wings were a little bit thinner to help increase the top speed. The landing gear also remained just about the same, just strengthened a little bit to account for an increase in weight. The cockpit canopy was also a teardrop bubble style, and the main armament was to be 4 20mm cannons. But that's basically where the big similarities come to an end. With the new engine, the nose and center of the fuselage had to be redesigned, both internally and externally. No longer needing the flat, open nose for the radial engine, the A2D had a much more pointed nose, with 2 3-bladed contra-rotating propellers and an air intake that was just behind them on the underside. The Allison T40 and a 500-gallon fuel tank were located just below the cockpit, buried underneath the pilot. The T40's dual exhaust ports were located just behind the wing and stuck out like a sore thumb, both figuratively and literally because they actually stuck out a little bit, and they were painted silver against a dark blue frame. The exhaust would also provide a small source of jet thrust. The back half of its fuselage was noticeably thicker, due to the greater size of the fuselage up by the cockpit. Lastly, moving back to the tail, both the horizontal and vertical surfaces were larger, just a few centimeters or inches in the former, and about half a meter for the latter, after some initial wind tunnel testing showed some potential instability. One final difference or design feature I want to note is the installation of a dive or speed brake under fuselage just behind the wing. While the A-1 Skyraider also had these brakes, it had 3 of them, 1 below and 2 on the sides, whereas the A2D had just the 1 on the underside. This brake was intended to be used for air-to-air combat, to facilitate tighter turns. While this wasn't a unique feature or anything like that, I do find it a bit interesting that a derivative of a plane that was known for ground attacking had something to make it more lethal in air-to-air combat, as the Skyshark's engine was still in development, and development in general was a bit slower after World War II ended due to a general lack of urgency. The first flight date for the Skyshark was planned for around mid-1949, and by that time the plane was completed, except for the very minor issue that it didn't actually have an engine in it. The Allison T40 was suffering from some development issues, Whether it was because there was a feature that allowed half of the engine to be shut off mid-flight, whether it was because the gear system needed to convert turbine power to the propeller, or whether it was frequent vibration issues, there was some element, some issue on the T-40 that seemed to give Allison trouble at every stage. But development of the engine continued regardless, due to the T-40 offering incredible power, over 5,000 horsepower on earlier models and around 7,000 on later models. If turboprop engines raise the performance ceiling over normal piston engines, then something like the T-40 would really raise that ceiling. But while the engine engineers were hard at work, the frame of the A2D just kinda had to sit around and wait. No temporary engine would be installed in the meantime to test out the plane's aerodynamics and control. From April to August 1949, the project sat effectively dormant. But in August, Allison finally sent over a T-40 engine. But even with engine in hand, the first flight of the A2D was still a ways away. The engine was not approved for flight testing as of yet, only for much safer ground-based testing. But hey, something is better than nothing, and this ground testing would hold them over until March 26, 1950, where the first Skyshark would take to the air. Because of the plane's everlasting engine issues, these initial flight tests were relatively short, and specifications like top speed were not tested yet. The first flights were more to see how the engine held up, and after just 3 flights, the engine had to be replaced, putting the project back on hold until October. In the meantime, Douglas actually then received orders from the US military for the Skyshark, an initial order of 10 in June, another order of 81 in August, and then another 250 in February the next year. What exactly happened in those limited flight tests and grounding until October that gave the Navy such confidence in the Skyshark? Well, the actual tested performance of the Skyshark actually had very little to do with it. It was instead because the Korean War started. Production and development of military weaponry would be ramping back up, and a high-powered attack plane that could also ideally take on enemy jet fighters would be an incredible weapon to have. I mean, so what if it didn't actually work right now? So what if the engine was incredibly finicky? The Skyshark had incredible potential, and the military needed some more modern attack planes, so Douglas got those contracts. Once flight testing resumed in October, things went a bit more smoothly, at least for a little while. They were able to conduct some top speed testing, hitting speeds anywhere between 475 and 501 miles an hour, which was excellent for an attack plane, but was also less than what they expected. Pilots would also report that the handling and maneuverability were both solid, and overall, the Skyshark was considered a plane with a great deal of promise. But while the test pilots were offering praise in terms of the plane's performance, the T-40 engines that were inside the planes were still incredibly problematic, and it seemed like when one issue was remedied, another one popped up in its place. The praise for the Skyshark meant very little if the engine wasn't reliable enough to fully live up to that praise, and the issues with the engine ended up coming to a head on December 19th, 1950. Piloted by Lieutenant Commander Hugh Wood, a fantastic name because I accidentally first read it as Huge Wood, he was flying the Skyshark on December 19th, when, surprise, surprise, there was an engine issue. Seemingly half of the engine failed, and the other half remained operational. while it was a feature of the T-40 that it could still operate with just half the engine running, and that was something the pilot could actively control, they noticed on the ground that the Skyshark was losing altitude at an alarming rate. Wood put the landing gear down to try and land it, but due to the speed at which he was dropping out of the sky, the landing gear was destroyed upon hitting the ground. The plane caught fire, and Wood lost his life in the crash, and the plane was lost as well. This left the Navy baffled and concerned by what just happened. After investigating the wreckage, they determined that Hugh Wood didn't go through the necessary procedure that allowed the engine to function at half power. If that procedure wasn't done, and one half of the engine happened to fail, then the other half that was left running would be running significantly worse than what it could be. Basically, it was just like the entire engine failed, even though only half of it failed. Why Wood didn't go through this procedure is a bit of a mystery. Perhaps something failed and he wasn't able to do that procedure. Perhaps he didn't know which half of the engine failed and thus couldn't do the procedure. Perhaps he didn't even know about this feature. Whatever the reason was, the first prototype was destroyed and the test pilot was lost. Luckily though, the second prototype was nearing completion, and it would likely be ready to fly early the next year, if the engine was ready to go, and it wasn't. Due to even more engine issues, 1951 came and went without a flight by the Skyshark, and it wasn't until April 1952 that the second prototype would take to the air, this one looking a little bit different visually in not having the dark blue paint job, instead just being bare metal. But realistically, at this point, it didn't matter how the Skyshark looked or even performed, as the Navy already viewed the project as a failure and started to cancel those larger production contracts. Other than the initial contract for the 2 prototypes, only the small contract for 10 production models was left intact. The production models began slowly trickling in, and after the 6th production model was delivered, the project was then officially cancelled. In its place as an attack aircraft, the older A-1 Skyraider, the plane it was supposed to replace, would end up seeing use up into the 1970s, and a newer jet-powered A-4D Skyhawk attacker, also made by Douglas, would first fly in 1954 and saw use with the Navy up until 2003. But back in the 1950s, the whole problem of needing some kind of interim aircraft that could be used on carriers became not a problem, through the introduction of steam-driven catapults on carriers and the reduction and eventual elimination of the smaller escort carrier class. The whole issue of jets not having acceleration and low-speed control was kinda made moot when the carriers were just naturally larger and they could be flung forward and basically thrown into the air at relatively high speeds. Overall, though, the A2D Skyshark sits today as a rather intriguing aircraft, if nothing else for the end result of the project, as a plane that was to combine the best of both worlds, the speed of jet power and the low-speed control of propeller power, to act as a sort of bridge until jet aircraft could serve on carriers. It ended up taking so long to do that jets improved and aircraft carriers improved to the point that it made such a bridge aircraft unnecessary, and the piston engine that it was supposed to succeed ended up far outliving it. It's akin to some kind of larger family dynamic, with the A1, A2D, and A4D being like the oldest, middle, and youngest child respectively, and for some reason, the middle child ends up being the unloved kind of black sheep of the family. Isn't that kind of weird how that's a stereotype, where the middle child just gets tossed to the side and forgotten about. Life's weird. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. I do love the name of Skyshark for a plane, mainly because it sounds like it'd be one of those creatures in a made-for-TV sci-fi channel movie, like Skyshark versus Mega Crocosaurus. Or maybe Skyshark was the starting point for Sharknado. Like, one flying shark just wasn't good enough, so they needed a whole swarm or a tornado of them. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.